Hello and welcome to live post-match reaction to the All Blacks versus France. The All Blacks won 26-13, and again we have another game that, let's be honest, we don't really want to be talking about because it's another game that's been marred by a red card or the decision. So what happened was Fall, who had a great start to the game, had been good under the ball, under the high ball, both defensively and attackingly, which I'd put in my notes, had suddenly got himself, got bumped on the way through, and that happens when you're chasing the ball, let's be honest, it happens all the time. So perhaps wasn't quite at the area where the ball's coming down as early as he was expecting to. Therefore, couldn't take off, set himself properly to jump properly, didn't get very far off the ground. Barrett came in much higher off the ground, hit him, and came down on his head. And therefore, Fall was not in a place to contest the ball at the same height. There was contact in the air. The player came down dangerously on his head, or head neck area. It was clearly a red card. Now that's led to a whole bunch of comments and reactions on the on social media, obviously, and it's kind of ruined a game, and it took the game away from being a contest. Up until that point, France were looking very good in this game, and it's a shame that we had that red card. But the referee had no real choice. This was this one of those training points. If you're not going to get high, then you're going to get red carded, and it's the player's fault rather than the referee's fault. Angus Gardner tonight had a pretty good game. Sure, all of the big calls went against France. I mean, very early on, before the red card, we had a great break by France. One of their players, the centre gone blank, was charging towards the try line, came up just short, got tackled just short, and momentum carried him over. But unfortunately, that first bump on the ground knocked the ball loose, and therefore the try got disallowed for a knock on. They had another try disallowed in the second half for second movement, which again looked worse on slow mo than in live time, but. Correct. He uses knees to propel him forward, therefore that's a double movement. So, yes, the calls went against France, but that doesn't mean that Angus Gardner was making the wrong calls. It's just that France called him unlucky, especially with that one in the first couple of minutes where he bounced short of the line. But they were the correct calls. So Fowl was having a great game up until that point. Real shame that happened. But it was the correct call. Barrett went off for a HIA straight away and never came back on. Damian McKenzie playing at 10 for the rest of the game. And that's why it's there, is because players will get injured, seriously injured, from these kind of situations. There's definitely a few comments out of Australia saying this wasn't actually the right rules, and yet Australia was one of the places where we had prior to where this law came in, or this interpretation came in, were complaining that the All Blacks, in particular, were looking up in the air and running through the landing zone, and therefore negating Folau because he was up in the air looking up. Everyone was looking up, so hey, everyone's trying to get the ball, but because they were on their feet running through that zone, he was getting hit and therefore coming down and having some pretty potentially nasty falls, and that ruined his confidence in getting up in the air. So that's quite where this law came back from, was because of that kind of play, and that's why we had that. I say that's why we've had this interpretation. It's an interpretation that caused a lot of discussion in Super Rugby about 2-3 years ago now when it came in. And we had some times where players lost their footing because it was a wet ground and they slid into that zone. They tried to stop, they couldn't stop, and they got red carded. And there was lots of things there that people were talking about, but that wasn't the case tonight. This wasn't about slipping on the ground. This was just that he got bumped on the way in. As I say, that happens. He got there perhaps a bit later than he should have, and needed to either bail out or catch and hold on to Barrett. That's where it's a training point that if that situation. Soon afterwards, fantastic break by Moody to score a try, and let's be honest, most people at that point where as soon as it went 7-3 up after 40 minutes, pretty much turned off and went and did something else. I'll be honest, I didn't actually pay as much attention to the game as I would do normally after that point, because, yeah, as a contest, the game was ruined, but the game wasn't ruined by the ref. This game was ruined by the players or a player getting it wrong, not by the ref, which is a bit of a problem. So I say, yeah, I kind of didn't pay that much attention, or as much attention as I would do normally to a game after that, which is a shame. It's not what we all kind of want. Ben Smith, broken field play, went through and scored a try. Now, both the Ben Smith try and the Joe Moody try, if there'd been someone at home in that 15 jersey, in that 15 position, would they have stopped them? Very possibly. And that's basically where, so that was where we could see that the French were low on numbers, and in that particular position and that particular space where those numbers were. On half an hour, pretty interesting that actually the French kicked a penalty rather than kicking to the corner. Were they really going to catch up a 14-3 deficit with threes? Probably not. But they were definitely making a very good fist of it, and they also wanted to get some reward for their efforts. Then just on half time, a loose kick with not quite the same follow up as a lot of the chasers, a lot of the other kicks had, was really led to the Geordie Barrett try, and that meant that suddenly it was 21-6 at half time rather than 14-6, and that made a big difference. And that, I mean, a lot of people at that point would definitely switch off, because yes, it had basically been all over. And if I look at some of the comments in the live chat here, JP saying drifted in and out of the game because of the red card. Andre earlier said basically he switched off after the red card as well. So there was definitely I say people not really paying that much attention. Then we had another try by Geordie Barrett after a good break by Dane McKenzie from memory, and that put it to 26-6 just before the hour mark. But that wasn't really indicative of how that second half had been going. France really did dominate that second half and had much the better of it. I said we had that second try disallowed for France, and France had 65% of the possession and 71% of the territory in that second half. They were playing with 14 men against 15 men for at least half an hour of it, because TJ Perinara got himself yellow carded. But you look at some of the defending by the All Blacks, 75% tackling, which is actually the same percentage as France did. But New Zealand were made to make 119 tackles to France's 73. You've got to play it down, and you're making the opposition make all those tackles. France really managed this game very well, having that with 14 men. And rebellious scope as well. The forwards were like school children against the French. No redeeming qualities in that. Yeah, the All Blacks definitely were struggling in that department. It ended up being 13 penalties each, but it definitely felt there was definitely a run during that first part of the second half where the All Blacks were giving up more penalties, which is what led to TJ Perinara's yellow card. So what happened? There was a tackle. He stood up on the French side of the tackle, picks up the ball after players had gone through, and went to play the ball. Now, immediately Justin Marshall's on the commentary going, "Oh, but where's the third man in there? There's no ruck formed." And sure, if we were talking about last season, that might be true. But the laws changed, and it really is disappointing when commentators can't keep themselves up to date with what the laws are. The law currently is every single player to get their hands on that ball has to come in from their own side. And that's what TJ Perinara didn't do. He stood up on the French side of the ball to pick up the ball. It's what Richie McCaw used to do all the time, but then it was legal. At the beginning of this season, they removed that and said, no, everyone has to come in from their own side, and that made it illegal, and it was quite rightly a penalty. And at that time, the All Blacks had been giving up plenty of penalties and had been warned. The next penalty in your 22 is a yellow card, definitely the next cynical one. That counts as being a cynical one. Now, if the player doesn't understand the rules, that's a coaching problem, and that's not a referee problem. and quite right, TG Perenara went onto the naughty voice chair for 10 minutes. During that time, again, in France, that was when the French had that second try disallowed. Jack, you might think it was a harsh yellow, but no, I disagree. It was a penalty, and it was just cumulative. The All Blacks were just being far too cynical with their penalties in that area of the pitch. The French line-out, again, didn't perform that greatly tonight. 5 missed line-outs there, which didn't help their cause. But I say they still dominated that second half. 20 turnovers by the All Blacks shows that they couldn't hold on to the ball, and that the French did very well there. 11 clean breaks to the All Blacks, 9 to France. These aren't numbers that you expect to see from a team that's been reduced to 14 men for the vast majority of the game. France played extremely well with 14 men. Couldn't quite break down the All Blacks in that second half. Weren't quite clinical enough to score the points. Got a bit unlucky with a couple of calls, but they were the correct calls by the referee. And it's disappointing that we've had a series that there are 2 games now that have promised so much that have got ruined. That have been, not got ruined, but have ceased to be competitive due to red cards and losing players, and that's a real shame for the series and for these games. And unfortunately, we'll have to see how the third games goes. But I think a lot of people will have switched off, and I think it has hurt the game. Because the All Blacks tests are some of the highest profile tests in the world. We just have to look at the numbers of viewers I get for post-match reactions. The biggest one last weekend was the All Blacks game, even though it wasn't the most competitive or the best game last weekend. But still, that got the most views because people do watch the All Blacks. The All Blacks is the biggest brand in world rugby, and to have games that aren't competitive like this that doesn't help the brand, doesn't help rugby, and in Australia in particular, that's a real problem at the moment because it is struggling for viewers. And let's hope they have a good game now between the Wallabies and Ireland, and let's go off and watch that. Thank you everybody for joining me. I'll be back, and we might try something new next weekend. I might try and do live match commentary of the All Blacks versus France's third test. Let's see if I can get that lined up here on YouTube. We obviously won't have the match footage, but you'll be able to have it either as your alternative sound if you want to watch the game, or if you don't have Sky or whatever, or the streaming service to watch it, then we could be an alternative way for you to have coverage of the game if you can't actually watch it through. If you don't have the subscriptions. So thank you very much for joining us. Let me know if you like the idea of that for next week in the comments down below. And catch you all and enjoy whatever rugby you're watching this weekend.